בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב, ל"ג בעומר שמח. Our hero for today, Rabbi Moshe Kalphon הכהן, or Kalphon Moshe הכהן, is a very unique personality, as we will see Bezrat Hashem. And also, learning about him can serve as a window into the history of a Jewish community, which I think that many of us do not have the opportunity to learn about and to speak about on our in a regular way in our usual learnings, and that is the Jews of the island Djerba. So the island Djerba is an island to the shores of Tunisia. It's a few hundred kilometers from the capital city of Tunisia, so it is in many ways a somewhat separate place, but it was always under the government of whoever was controlling Tunisia, whatever it was the Ottoman Empire, or later it was a semi-independent state, and then in the 1880s it became a colony of the French. That's the basic history of Tunisia, and then they received their independence in the middle of the 20th century. And Djerba was always under the control of whoever controlled Tunisia. However, because it was separated and secluded in some ways, it was also the tens of thousands of Muslims, maybe 100,000 Muslims on the island, and a few thousand Jews for a very long time. That was the history of this island. And because it was secluded, as I said, then in many ways it was more conservative than the rest of Tunisia, which was much more taken in the trends of the whole Africa continent, which not necessarily was always the most modern it was, but to the measure that Africa was modernized, so, and Tunisia is fairly modernized, then so was the rest of the Jews of Tunisia. But the Jews of Djerba remain almost always one leg behind, which is an important background fact to understand our story. So we have in one of the Sefarim that Rabbi Moshe Kalphon הכהן writes, which is called Brit Kehuna. This is a book, I mean, it's a series of books, in which he tries to record all the special minhagim of Djerba. It was one of the most important features of Rabbi Moshe Kalphon הכהן, which is that he was a great adherent and follower of the minhagim, the special minhagim of Djerba, which are very ancient, and you can trace in them some minhagim that they are the only ones that preserve them from the time of the Geonim, and maybe even before. So a very special nusach of Kiddush for Leil HaSeder that no one else has, and we have it recorded only in a Siddur of Rav Saadia Gaon, going back to the 10th century. So just to understand the antiquity of their minhagim, they have a tkiyat shofar on Erev Shabbat, just before Shabbat comes, and this minhag almost nowhere in the Jewish world. There are a few enclaves, but almost nowhere in the Jewish world, and it is recorded in the Mishnah, in Masechet Psachim. So very ancient traditions. He himself, in this introduction to the Brit Kehuna, by the way, he wrote, it was published, he printed more than 50 Sefarim during his lifetime. I believe it's 80 now, and there are still some in manuscript. So if you are looking for goals to donate for, I think they are still looking to print a few more Sefarim. So an extremely fruitful writer, and this Brit Kehuna is one of these most important ones. And in the introduction, he writes the following. You can see it in source Aleph. עירנו Djerba, our city, the island of Djerba, היא עתיקה מאוד. It's very ancient. וישוב אחינו בית ישראל בה, he says the settlement of our brothers, the children of Israel, in it, להשערת מורינו וקרובינו המהרשך, so to the estimation of מורינו הרב שאול הכהן, הוא מחורבן בית ראשון. So they claim to be there from the destruction of the first temple. According to another Chacham, it's from the destruction of the second temple. He says, according to one of the non-Jewish historians, יישוב אחינו בתוניסיה היה כ-70 שנה קודם ספירת הנוצרים. So 70 שנה קודם ספירת הנוצרים. So that would put it in the first century BC. And היהודים באו לתוניס קודם ב-300 שנה משנולד ישו הנוצרי, ואחר כך מחורבן בית השני. He says maybe they came in few waves. So one wave was before the destruction, and the second wave was after the destruction. So it's a very ancient settlement. It is composed almost only from Kohanim. So, and again, a very interesting feature of the Jews in Djerba, almost all are Kohanim. There are a few non-Kohanic families which associate themselves with the Shevet of Zvulun. They say that the Shevet of Zvulun, what the special skill of Zvulun was lechof yamim mishkon, that they were very good at sailing. So they claim that they were sitting in the shore of the Mediterranean, of the Yam Hatichon, and they sailed from there to North Africa, and they came to Tunisia, and later to Djerba. So they say that's how the Jews of Zvulun came to Djerba. These are very interesting tradition. Obviously, there is no way to validate such claims. I mean, it's a tradition. It's a tradition. But there are many, as I said, there are many Kohanim there. They have very interesting questions that you can find almost nowhere in the responsa literature. For example, what do you do if all of your shul is composed out of Kohanim? So should they all go to the Birkat Kohanim? What do you do if the other? Who do you put Ma'aleh Torah? So many interesting questions that came out of this special situation in which so many in this island were Kohanim, and traditionally there were two big neighborhoods, or you may say ghettos, of Jews in Djerba, which were called the new neighborhood, and I mean the great neighborhood, the big neighborhood, and the small neighborhood, and the Jews lived there, in these two ghettos. And usually they were in good relationship with their Muslim neighbors. As you can imagine, these new peaks and also down minutes. So there were times in which they had it good, there were times in which it was worse, but basically throughout the years they were able to live in a fairly peaceful manner. Okay, so that's the basic facts about this island of Djerba. In its peak, the Jewish population was 5,000 Jews. That's what we speak about. Nowadays, there are still Jews in Djerba. It's very interesting. There are still Jews in Djerba. It's around 1,000 Jews, which is a big number. It's one of the biggest communities in Africa nowadays. Of local Jews. I don't speak about the safari in Kenya, but places in which people live and raise their children. So it's one of the biggest communities in Africa, and they have yeshivot, they have operating synagogues, shuls. I mean, they are completely operative, and they are very orthodox, which is again a very interesting feature of this community about which we'll speak Bezrat Hashem in length, because our hero is one of the main reasons why they were able to defend themselves against the waves of modernity, which cracked down almost all walls, we may say, of the Jewish religion, almost everywhere on the globe. So what was so special about this island? We spoke a little about its geography, which is important, but Bezrat Hashem, we must also speak about the people that were responsible for how this community was managed. So he was born to a family of Rabbanim, a long chain of Rabbanim, and he came to be born in a very special circumstances, mean, they write it down in his sefarim, so I mean, I guess it is right. It's a strange story, it is for us. We live in a very different environment. So his father married his mother, of course, and they had 3 daughters. And then the father had enough with daughters, and he said to his wife, I see that you cannot bring me boys, so I'm going to marry a second wife. His wife was opposed, as you can imagine. His wife was opposed to such a measure. He said, no, give me a more year, and you see everything would be fine. I don't know how she could promise that, but that's what she said to him. And he said, no, I'm going. And then she's, no, I do not allow you, to the extent that such a sentence was able to be said under the circumstances. And then what he did was, he told her one day that he's going to the second neighborhood. Said there were 2 big neighborhoods of Jews. He told her, I'm going there for a night to my business. And okay, fine. So he went to his business. But the morning come and he does not return. So she's standing outside of her home, waiting for her husband to come back. And I guess she was a young and still a naive woman. And one of the neighbor women, which was, I guess, more mature and experienced, told her, what are you waiting for? Oh, she told her, I'm waiting for my husband. So she told her, your husband is already married to a new wife in the second Jewish neighborhood. And then, according to the story, the mother of our hero said, you know what, I do not wish him to die, but I do wish him to become poor, which again, I mean, if you think about the ramifications, then it's cutting your nose in spite of your face, but fine, but that's what she said. So I wish him to become poor, and the woman that is the shadchanit, she said she should burn. And that's what happened. So he lost almost all of his wealth. It was a very wealthy family. He lost almost all of his wealth in the coming year. And the woman that was responsible for the shidduch in the second neighborhood, she fell into, they say, into a pile of old olives, I guess after the oil was extracted, and it's supposed to be very hot. And it's not exactly to be burned down, but she died a very horrific death. And that's how her curse came to be. So that's the story they tell in the books, in the introduction. And yes.
What year are we talking?
What year are we talking? Yeah, 1874. 1874. And I mean, just to put us in some proportion, so 1874 is after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. And we have in Israel, in Eretz Israel, we have in Tafresh Lamed Chet, right? We have Petach Tikva established. So 4 years later. So that's the basic timing. And the wife, this woman that you just spoke about, meaning the old wife, right, of the father of Rabbi Shalom, she gives birth indeed to a boy in the next 9 months. So that's a story how he came to be born. The mother, by the way, was called Traki or Tarki. That was her name. Now, the son was called Moshe after his grandfather. However, the mother gave him the nickname Kalphon. And the nickname took hold, and everyone called him Kalphon. And then, for the rest of his life, there are contradicting evidence. If he desired to be called Kalphon Moshe HaCohen or Moshe Kalphon HaCohen. And there are different explanations he gave each time he has to be called in a certain way. So in certain places, he's asking to be called Moshe Kalphon HaCohen because his real name is Moshe. So that should be the first name. In other places, he says, I prefer that Kalphon would come first because I am worried that people would think that Kalphon is my last name and it would be forgotten that I am a Cohen, and then my children will not remember that they are Kohanim. So I want Kalphon to be the first name, so Cohen would be clearly my last name. So different accounts. People nowadays prefer sometimes to call him Kalphon Moshe הכהן because they want the ראשי תיבות כמהה, כף, מם, ה', Kalphon Moshe הכהן. And that is because כמהה in Hebrew means to long for something, to desire something. And as we will see, Rabbi Moshe Kalphon הכהן, all of his life longed to come to Eretz Israel and to be part of the Zionist project. And it's a very prominent, we may say, character line of his. So the word kameha, the kaf mem hey, is very appropriate. Okay, so that's his birth in 1874. The family became extremely poor, and so it was difficult for him to learn Torah, and he had to share learning Torah with earning for his living. But something very interesting happened because of that, and that is that he became very, very strong in his opinion that he should make his living not from Torah. I guess because he had to work so hard for his living, and also his parents could not support him from a very young age, he became very independent, and he didn't want to be provided by someone else. He wanted to work for his living. He became, at the age of, when he was 17, so around 1890, his father became the Av Beidin in another small city there called Zarazis. And his father became the rabbi, so he became the shochet. He was 17 years old, he became the shochet. However, the working conditions were very harsh. It was a small city, also very poor, and he had the shchita, the slaughtering house was not even under a roof. It was in some courtyard, and he was doing the shchita there during the summer, during the winter, and so he became very weak. It seems that he was very weak to begin with, because he was sick almost throughout all of his life. And then he became sick with a certain fever, and he was able to heal, but it damaged his sight, right, his eyes, for a very long time. And he needed to wear glasses, which for us may seem as a simple thing, but for them was a very special thing that he had to wear glasses. And so he had to wear glasses, and he couldn't read at night. We have a cat inside the kitchen. I'm sorry.
That's an unusual break in a share.
Okay. Okay. We'll continue. Yeah. Okay. So back to the learning. So the rabbis of Djerba who saw that on one hand we're speaking about a boy that has very high skills in his learning, but on the other hand his father is taking him into work because they needed it to support the family. They were able to convince the father to send the son into a yeshiva in Djerba. So he is going back to his learning. And at the age of 21, he is married to a cousin of him called Messiada. And they, during his life, they had 8 children together. One of them was died as an infant, but the others were able to survive. And some of his children, all of his children, I think, made Aliyah to Eretz Israel, and some of them were Rabbanim here in Eretz Israel. In 1897, he's still a student. In 1897, so he is about 24. Yeah, 23. So he's about 23. He wants to make Aliyah after getting married, and maybe the first boy, he wants to make Aliyah to Eretz Israel, that, as we just heard, is waking up. All of the sudden, it's still before the British mandate, it's still before World War I, but Jews are beginning, the first Aliyah begins, and Jews are beginning to come in very small numbers, but are beginning to come to Eretz Israel, and he wants to join also. and his father comes to Djerba, and I think it's very clear that his father was a very strong personality. His father comes to Djerba and to the yeshiva and convince him to stay in Djerba. And the reasoning is very interesting. He says to him, according to my calculations, Mashiach is going to come in 1917. So why would you go now? Just wait to 1917. And it's an it's an interesting calculation. It's an interesting calculation. And that's and he receives his father's opinion, but to the rest of his life, and that's he writes, to the rest of his life, he says, if I would have just gone back then, I would have been in Eretz Israel. And as it happened to be, he never was able to do Aliyah. Every time he wanted to do Aliyah, something happened. And he was never able to do Aliyah. And he was always sorry that he didn't do it when he was young and able in 1897. Okay. At the age of 25, just a few years later, he was asked to become a dayan in Djerba. He refused for the reason we said earlier, because he didn't want to be paid for Torah or for a rabbinic position. And he tried to work in other things. However, he was not very successful in his business. I mean, it's not always, it's the Cinderella story, right? That he refused to work in the Rabbanut, but he was able, someone like the Rambam, in few hours a day, he was able to earn his living, and then he would be able to learn throughout the whole day. But it doesn't always succeed. So he just was very, very, very poor. And but he was learning Torah and going on. Again, in a few years later, he was again asked to become the rabbi. Again, he refused. And then in 1917, when Mashiach is supposed to come, the old rabbi of Djerba called Rabbi Moshe Mazuz. Maybe some of you know Rabbi Meir Mazuz. It's part of the same family. All of these are from Djerba. So he passes away. And then they ask our hero, Rabbi Moshe Kalphon Hacohen, to become a dayan in Djerba. And this time he agrees. Why? Different reasons. Maybe up until now he was waiting for the Mashiach, and he said, it would be easier for me to go to Eretz Israel if I would not become a dayan. Maybe because after the ptira of the great rabbi of Djerba, he felt the public need for him teaching Torah. He has a tshuva, you can see it here in source bet. He has a 9-volume responsa series. And it's called Shoel Venishal. And he explained in the introduction, he didn't want to call it Shoel Umeishiv. It should be, I'm being asked and I answer. Why does he call it Shoel Venishal? I mean, there is someone who asks and there is someone that is being asked. He says, that's because I didn't want to write about myself that I am able to answer. So I prefer the name Shoel Venishal. I'm the one who is being asked, that's for sure. Am I being able to answer? That's a question. So that's why I called the Sefer Shoel Venishal. So in the second volume of Shoel Venishal, in Yoreh De'ah, number 90, there is a question. שאלה, מי שהפציר בו דיין העיר לקבל עליו משרה זו להיות דיין ולא רצה. So if there is a case, hypothetical one, of someone that didn't agree to become a dayan, ונשבע, and he took an oath, that he would not become a dayan, כי זה מן הנמנע אצלו, אפילו אם יפצירו בו אביו ורבו. He says he took an oath that even if his father would plead with him, or his rabbi, he still would not take the position. His son says that this tshuva was written about himself. So obviously there was very high pressure on him, including his father that we already saw was a very strong element in his life. And this is his rabbi. He took an oath that he would not become a dayan. ועתה הפצירו בו איזה מהבעלי דברים עד בוש, but they still continue to plead and to argue with him, וכמעט לפי דעתם תתקלקל השורה, כי גם הממונים ישמיטו עצמם. He says, they tell me that if I would not take the position, other would also go away. That people want me to become I mean, he doesn't say me, it's humble again, so he says it about someone else, but it's the story that if I would not take the position, then the other authorities would also step down. Because, to be honest, no one wants to be the Dayan of the city if you know that there is someone that is more able than you sitting. I mean, I would not want to be the rabbi of the shul if the chief rabbi would also sit here, because it's ridiculous. So the same way, he does not, I mean, the people told him, you are the greatest Torah authority of the city, so it is inappropriate that someone else would be the Dayan. And he says, וגם הוא עצמו צידד בדבר זה, אולי חס וחלילה איסור להשמיט עצמו במקום שהעת והשעה צריכים. He says, and also even this man, right, that took an oath not to become a Dayan, also begin to wonder, maybe the time requires that he would take upon himself this position, ועוד כי זה היה בימי ילדותו כבן 25 שנה, also he took the oath when he was 25, so he was young, now he is older, and things have changed. He says, I have a few white lines, it means in his hair. So he says, so I took an oath, it was the situation was X, now the situation is X plus 10. Right, so it's a different situation. And he says, but on the other hand, he took the oath because according to the Rambam, you're not allowed to be paid for your Torah learning. So maybe that is an oath to uphold an halachic position, and you cannot back down such an oath. You can only back down oaths that are ahalachic. So they are part. They are not leisur, they are not leheter. So you took an oath, you don't eat ice cream, you can undo the oath. You can be nish'al. You can undo the oath. But if you take an oath to keep a certain halachic perspective, to take a certain halachic bar, then you are not able to step down from such an oath. So that is what is worried. And it's a long tshuva. I did not record it here, the whole tshuva, but is conclusion, המורה מכל זה, so the conclusion is, שאין כאן איסור שבועה, that the reasons why this שבועה does not apply anymore, the שבועה that he, meaning, I took, does not apply anymore, ומכל מקום אם בא להחמיר, יישאל בפני שלושה, but if he wants, he can do התרת נדרים in front of 3 people. And indeed, he is becoming the Dayan in 1917, the Dayan of Djerba. In the beginning, he makes a condition with them that he would only be the 3rd Dayan. He would not be the Av Beidin, would not be the main Dayan. However, very, very quickly, it becomes clear that, again, you can play games. But if all questions are coming to you, you can call yourself the 3rd Dayan, but you are the one calling the shots. So it just became the Av Beidin of Djerba. And after he took that, he became a very prominent leader. Meaning, after he took the position, he did not remain hiding, but he took it very seriously. He made many takanot. He also printed a whole book with the takanot he made for Djerba, just a few of them. So, for example, he changed the learning in the yeshivot, which up till then was more about iyun, learning Gemara in depth, and he thought it's more important that they would learn halacha. So he changed the balance from an iyun learning to halacha learning. So that's one thing very important that he did. Another thing was he opposed the party of Lag BaOmer, because he thought that there are immodesty and improper behaviors. So he said, you can learn Torah, you can do other things, but he was opposed to the Hilula of Lag BaOmer. Now in Djerba, there is a very ancient shul, one of the most ancient shuls in the world, called Al-Gareb or something like that. And this shul, they had a very long-standing tradition of celebrating Lag BaOmer in a very massive way. However, the shul was not under his authority. He was the Rav of the Kehila, but the shul had another Rav, and he couldn't shut down the celebration in the shul, but he didn't go. Now, the celebration is being conducted there to this day. If you look, You can find it online from Djerba. Non-Jews are coming. It's a very big thing. Now we have a very interesting memoir written by a certain Rav Rabinovich from South Africa. Rav Levi Rabinovich, or Louis, is better known as Louis Rabinovich, and he was the chaplain of the South African regiment in World War II. And he found himself, after the British have liberated Tunisia, then he found himself in Djerba for Pesach, and then for Lag BaOmer, and he helped. He met with Rav Moshe Kalphon Hacohen. It's very interesting to read it, because these are really two very different worlds that suddenly were meeting, and it's very interesting. I would mention it also Be'ezrat Hashem later. But one of the things that he writes is that Rav Kalphon told him, do not go to the party, in the Lag BaOmer party in this shul. And Rav Rabinovich really wanted to go. So even offered to take statement to Rav Kalphon, maybe you do not go because you don't have a car. I have a car, I will drive you. No, it didn't work. So Rav Rabinovich went. And what Rav Rabinovich writes is that if he first went into the shul, and everyone was learning, and everything was very mechubad, so he didn't understand why Rav Kalphon is so opposed. And then he went to the hall that was just across the street from the shul, and he said, when I saw what is going on there, I understood why he is opposing the whole celebration. So it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting remark. So that's another thing that he did. He made a takana that you are not allowed to have more than one minyan in a specific shul. So if there is a shachrit and people are late, either that they join the shachrit or Musaf or Shabbat, either they join the main minyan or they can go to somewhere else. But you do not open a second minyan in the same place, which is something that many Rabbanim would have maybe wanted to enact, but that's usually it's a war against the wind. Another thing, another very important thing is fierce opposition to the opening of a Kol Israel Chaverim school. Now, what is Kol Israel? Called the Alliance. So the Alliance, the Kol Israel Chaverim, or Kiach, we call it in Hebrew, is an organization by French Jews for the sake of all of their brothers which are in the darkness and do not understand and are not part of the modern world, and we would say today the progressive world. We speak about the 19th century, but the beginning of the 20th century. But for all of these, for all of their brothers, which the light of knowledge did not yet shine upon them. So the French Jews, I'm a little cynical, but they were really coming from a very humanistic agenda and point of view, and they were trying to teach. So they opened schools in North Africa, also in Israel, and in other places by the Alliance, in which instead of the old Chadarim, which were very primitive in their learning strategies and pedagogic, and I mean, they were backward. So they said we would open modern schools with new methods that come from Paris, from France. We would train the teachers in the most modern methods and ways. And also we teach the children French, which obviously is the most important, as everyone born in French knows, then French is the most important language on earth, maybe even beyond that. So we will teach them French, we will teach them European culture, which again, obviously is the most advanced and important culture in the universe, and they would become happy because you teach them all of these important things. And in many places, the Rabbanim accepted these new schools because in reality, they donated a lot of money. The schools were modern, the buildings were beautiful. They were enabling children that without that would not be able to learn. They enabled them to learn, and they trained them to become professionals in different fields. So everything was seemingly nice. What was clear just a few years later was that the level of religious observance was not very important in the eyes of many of these teachers. Not necessarily the people that established the alliance, by the way. They did not see it as extremely important, religious studies, but they were not necessarily against. They wanted to add on the religious studies also non-religious studies. However, the teachers usually were very far from religious observance. They were the most, again, I would use nowadays terms, they were the most leftist, right? I'm speaking Jewishly, elements of the Jewish society, because who would become a teacher going from France to Tunisia? It would be someone that has a very strong agenda. Now, agenda for what? If he has agenda for Torah, then he would teach Torah in France. It was needed enough in France. So if I am going from France to Tunisia, I'm going because I think there is something in France they do not have in Tunisia. So I'm almost for sure someone that is very, very strong in Europeanism, but not in Yahadut. And many of them were just atheists, many of the teachers. So again, they would come, they would put a kippah in the school because these were the takanot, but they did not adhere to anything. And you can imagine what the children were taught. And the bottom line was that a very large portion of the Jews of North Africa lost their observance in very short time. Now, it's a part of history that is less known. Usually we tend to think that in North Africa, everyone was very conservative and the people remain orthodox. That is not right. It's not, again, depends obviously where, but as a large picture, it is not correct. In the minute that they met with modernity, then their dealing with it was nothing better than the way that the Jews in the West were able to deal, meaning a catastrophe. Now, in Djerba, Rabbi Moshe Kalphon Hacohen was greatly opposing the opening of the Alliance School. They were able to open it, but almost no one came, and in the end, they were teaching Muslim students. And that is not because you oppose modernity, as I hope that you will be able to see in a few minutes. In fact, he was not only thinking that modernity is something that we should accept, he saw modernity as the footsteps of Mashiach. However, he understood the importance of chinuch and that you can never outsource chinuch to people that do not share your worldview. That is something that we have to learn it many times, unfortunately.
Just interesting, at that time, did they have, like people really observant religiously and know modern teaching?
Almost no one. That was the problem. That was the problem. Yeah, for sure. For sure. As I said, the heads of alliance, they were not necessarily interested in stripping out Judaism. That was not, again, they didn't see halacha as important. If they would have seen that, they would have acted differently. But on the other hand, they were not warriors against halacha. They didn't care. For them, what was important was, let's liberate these Jews from the shackles of old teaching. Yeah. So they can go with a kippah and sit in a sukkah, but they should be modern, because again I'm cynical because the world is cynical, because we had 2 world wars, we had the Holocaust, we saw that these modern and liberal, and we see to this day, right, that it's very cheap to speak, but they act many times very differently. So we are not so impressed anymore with European liberalism and modernity and everything that comes with it.
But now we have in Israel, we have people who has education and observance.
Yeah, now we have it. But back then they didn't have it. So, and in the trying to balance out, they thought, okay, so it's more important for our Jewish children around the world to be able to join the forces of light, of enlightenment, right? It's not so, again, we have hindsight, and in hindsight, you always see, as they say, 2020, right? You have perfect seeing. So we know it was a failure, and that many Jews became assimilated. But we have to be very careful when we criticize people like the heads of the aliens, because they were really good people that wanted the best according to their understanding of the reality. Their understanding of the reality was very lacking. But it is very easy for us to see that 100 years later. Okay, so he opposed the opening of the school, and as a consequence, Djerba remained, as I said, very observant to this very day. And in a short time, nowhere else in Tunisia they were able to produce rabbis, because as it happened to be, all the new generation was swept in these new winds. And you needed rabbis, so Djerba became the powerhouse producing rabbis to the whole of Tunisia. And I dare say, I mean, I didn't check it statistically, but I dare say that even nowadays in the Tunisian community here in Israel, most of the rabbis to this day are from Djerbian descendants. I believe so. I believe so. So he was able to do something that almost no one else in the Jewish world was able to do, which was to block, to stop the new schools from emerging and destroying the observance and the Jewishness of the young generation. But on the other hand, it did not mean that he put high walls and completely banned everything that is modern. I mean, in Eastern Europe, you also had people and communities that were able to stop, at least for a time, the advance of modernism, but they paid very heavy price. I would speak now in Koresh terms. They were backwatered. Right? They were not able to enjoy modernity and its fruits because they had to block modernity from their chinuch, from their education. So I believe it was the right choice in the times, but it came with very high price. He was able to combine, because of the special, as I said, geographic place that he was in, and the special mindset of the Jews that he was able to lead them, and his own personality, which obviously was very, very strong. So he was able to create this system in which modernity is being accepted, and technology and everything that comes with it, and even, as we'd say, modern values. But chinuch remained traditional. He was able to do that, which again is no small feat. And that for itself would make him a very special figure, even without things that we would speak about Be'ezrat Hashem in a few minutes. Okay. In 1931, he is losing his firstborn son, which was called Rabbi Avraham, was a great Talmid Chacham. He wrote books already before he was niftar. His son. This affected him greatly. And in source Gimel, you can see it's from his memories, and it was printed by his grandson. The grandson is the son of the niftar. So he writes the following: מודה אני ועוזב את דרכי ומידותיי, אשר בעוונות הרבים במחלתו ליל י"ב טבת שנת התרצ"א, 1931, כמעט לא אכלתי ולא שתיתי ולא ישנתי. He says, when my son becomes sick, I myself became so sick, I didn't eat, I didn't drink, I didn't sleep. ובעוונותיי הייתי כמעט כאבן דומם, and that made me as a stone. Maybe you can say he was stoned, right? As a stone. ולא התפללתי, ולא התחננתי, ולא צעקתי לפני השם בעל הרחמים לרפאותו ולהחיותו. He says, I was so stoned, I was not able to daven. And he saw that as a factor in the death of his son, that he did not pray as he should have. So just this, the guilt that he is taking with him. And he says, instead, הייתי כמעט כל הימים והלילות הנזכרים כאיש נדהם שומר עליו ממש. כאילו זה תלוי בשמירתי וברפואת הרופא. He says, I was always next to his bed, and as his life were dependent on me sitting next to his bed, obviously he was not able to contribute too much just sitting next to his bed, but I couldn't leave the bed and go to daven. And he says, בליל כ' בטבת בעוונותינו הרבים עלתה נשמתו הטהורה לשמי מרומים just 8 days later, from י"ב טבת to כ"ט, from the 12th of טבת to the 20th of טבת. So 8 days עלתה נשמתו הטהורה לשמי מרומים, ועל זה אני מודה אל השם, ועוזב ומתחרט, אז I regret my sins. והנני מקבל עליי בלא נדר. Now, see what he is taking upon himself. That's his tshuva, as he sees from his failure. He says, אני מקבל עליי בלא נדר, להקדים תמיד תפילה להשם, טרם כל התעסקות ברפואה. He says, I would always first pray, and only then would engage in medicine. Now, obviously, it's a question of if there is a chaotic situation, then you need first. If you see someone chas v'chaila after a road accident, do not stand and pray. First, apply medical care. However, it means after this first response, then you must make time to daven, no less that you make the time to sit next to the person. It's a very, I feel it's very interesting and very touching. And he says also, again, it's very interesting, וכן לאכול ולישון, ולשתות ולישון, לפחות מה שאפשר לקיום הנפש דרך בינונית, למען נוכל להתפלל אל השם בבחירה ובדמעות. Very practical and rational. He says, part of the problem was that I didn't take care of myself. As they say always in the air flights, first take care of yourself, and only then you can take care of others. There is something very true to that. It didn't help his son that he was not eating and not drinking and not sleeping. So it was better if he would have taken care of himself, and then he would have been able to make better. I don't think that he would have helped his son if he would be rational. But at least in his own view, he would have been able to take better decisions when to pray, when not to pray, what to do, if he would have been taking care of himself. So again, extremely and very deeply religious, but also very deeply rational, right? And practical. I see that as something that represents really Rabbi Moshe Kalphon הכהן, the way that he was walking himself in the world, which on one hand was very, very religious, extremely religious, very deeply feeling God, and on the other hand, very practical and rational. And he was not someone that is waiting for miracles. He was someone that thought that we need to work for the miracles to happen. And that brings me to the fourth source, which I think, again, is very educating. So he was very Zionist, which is a surprise because, as I said, he was an opposer of alliance. And many people saw, Rabbi writes in his memoir, then when he saw him, he was sure that he was meeting someone from the Turei Karta, that is words. So he was sure someone, he was very traditional clothes, and he was sure that it's someone opposing schools, modern schools. So obviously this is someone that is, we call today, ultra-Orthodox. And then he began to speak with him, and he understood that this is someone that reads all the newspapers, and is a supporter of the Zionist movement. And not only supporter in words and ideas, he was a paying member. And now there are people who try to claim that he was very naive, he was sitting there in Djerba, he didn't understand that most of the Zionists were non-observant, because they cannot square it. How someone that was so Orthodox, it's an anachronistic term, but so Orthodox, how can he support such a secular movement, and secular to the core? But for him, just as we saw with his son, Death, he was both deeply religious, but also deeply practical, and he understood this is the practical way to move forward. These are the people that right now are acting. Be'ezrat Hashem, they would be choser b'tshuva, but as for now, that's how we should walk. That's how we should go. And again, when Rav Rabinovich met with him in 1944, right? It's in the middle of the Second World War. It was after the Nazis occupied Tunisia and Djerba for almost a whole year, and the Jewish community in Djerba was spared, which is also attributed to his success because he was able to pay them off. He met with the Nazi officials and he paid them 50 kilograms of gold, which was obviously a very huge sum. And that way he was able to pay them off. And they were supposed to come back and exterminate everyone, but then the English came. So he was able to buy time and to save the Jewish community. Again, something that, I mean, I do not, obviously he met with people that he was able to do so. Many Jewish leaders would obviously would have loved to have such Nazi officials, but he was able to do that. He was able to pull it off and to pay them and to postpone until the British liberated Djerba. So again, that was very something that I think we should, we can all understand that it's something to be appreciated. And then when Rav Rabinovich came there, he said that I met with him and he gave a drasha. And Rav Rabinovich says, I didn't understand the Arabic, but I heard that he speaks about Zion and Sion and Eretz Israel. So obviously something was going on. And he said after that, he gave me a sefer of his, a sefer drashot called Darchei Moshe. And again, one of the 80 Sfarim. So he gave him a sefer of his and sefer drashot, sermons book, and told me to read the drasha on Nitzavim. And I would like now to read with you some parts of this drasha on Nitzavim, which I think is very clear. Now, this is something they printed in 1935. So, long before.
What language did he write his books in?
Ivrit. I mean, maybe some of them are in Arabic, I don't know, but everything that I read was in Ivrit. So he says the following, source ד', we would finish with that. כבר ניצוצי הגאולה האירו, ומאירים מעת לעת. Says, we already begin to see the ניצוצי הגאולה, the sparks of redemption. So he writes that in 1935. כמו שיראה כל מבין ומשכיל, הנותן לב ועין חודרת. He says, everyone who understands and give his eye and heart can see that. Now, unfortunately, he writes that, as I said, in 1935. Even 10 years later, there would be certain people, certain leaders in Europe that would tell their people not to go to Eretz Israel because it is better to remain either in the Soviet Union or even, again, they didn't understand what they are dealing with, obviously, but even in Nazi-occupied Hungary, and not to flee to Eretz Israel because this is somewhere in which the Sitra Achra, the other side, in control. And he, in 1935, is able to recognize that we deal here with what we call today the he writes that also, Atchalta de Geula, the beginning of redemption. And he says, everyone who sees, and he's sitting there in Djerba, and he understands what is going on here. And he says, why do I say that? He has 13 reasons. Let's see some of them at least quickly. Aleph, אתה בארצות הנאורות, רבים מאחינו בית ישראל שבחוץ על הארץ זכו אל אזרחיות גמורה. He says, first reason why do I think that we are in time of redemption is emancipation. Emancipation is a sign of redemption. That's very, very interesting. Again, from someone that refuses strongly to have the school of alliance. These are the representatives of emancipation. He would not let them introduce their school into Djerba because he understood what chinuch le'yahadut should be. But on the other hand, he says, yes, I recognize. And that's, again, for us, I think it's simple that we are able to see that modernity should be not only accepted, but advanced. However, without any compromise on our chinuch. But this is a position that we paid very high, how they say, tuition in order to learn. And he was able to see it in the first minute. So first, emancipation. I'm skipping to bet. הרבה עיירות ומושבות בארץ נעשו כגן עדן, ובם עובדים הרבה עיקרים אחרים. He says, now, again, in 1935, so after already, it's the second and third aliyah, says, Baruch Hashem, Eretz Israel is being settled by Jews. Third, שפתנו העברייה, אשר כמעט מיום שגלינו ועד הייתה שכוחה ועוזבת, הנה היא שפה חיה מדוברת. Says, the coming back into life of speaking Ivrit is a sign of redemption. Again, in Eastern Europe at that time, and to this time in some places, they would not speak Hebrew because Hebrew is the language of the Zionim, so we need to speak the Mamalushan, right? We need to speak Yiddish. Fourth, סלילת הדרכים והמצאת המכונות הקיטוריות ליבשה, לים ולאוויר, אשר מיום ליום הולכים ומתרבים להקריב המורחקים בזרוע. He says, all of these modern technologies of transportation, trains, he speaks about מכונות קיטור, right, steam engines, and ships, and he says, בכלל זה המברקים אשר נתחדשו על ידי הרדיו. All of that is for the sake of bringing the Jews back into Eretz Israel. So that's a sign of redemption. Fifth, המכונות העובדים בימים האלה בערי סדום ועמורה והיישוב המתחדש שם. Again, very interesting. It says, on ים המלח, where Sodom and Gomorrah were, in סדום ועמורה, these places that were desolated from the time of Avraham Avinu, and now they are establishing factories there. To this day we have מפעלי ים המלח. It says that is a sign of redemption, that the places of destruction become again inhabited. So this is something I think I never saw before. Very interesting. Very, as a sign of redemption. Sixth, היישוב אשר גדל ועלה למעלה ראש בארצנו, כמאה מושבות וכעיירות. It says again the growth of the Jewish settlements, and they are being able to produce fruits and produce. Now seventh, look at that. התכוננות חבר הלאומים, the founding of the League of Nations. This is before the UN, right? The League of Nations. This is a sign of redemption, that the nations begin to seek peace. Now, he knows very well that this is an institution that still needs to be advanced. And he writes a whole book about how he wants it to be in Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim should be the place from which Torah goes out to the world. We have a long way to go. But there's even that some people desire for something like the League of Nations or later the UN. Now, again, I know what is happening in Hague nowadays. We all know the shortcomings of these places, for sure, for sure. But you know what? Even the facade at least means that people understand the importance of at least seeing as wanting peace and seeing as being fair among the nations. This is something that it's better than without it. It's better than without it. So again, it's very interesting. So that is a sign of redemption. Eighth, the Balfour Declaration, obviously. And again, his father said that 1917 is the year of redemption. So 8 is the Balfour Declaration. 9th, that's unfortunately is wrong. What he says, המלחמה העולמית, he speaks about the First World War, אשר כמוה לא נהייתה וכמוה לא תוסיף. It's such a great war that has never been like that. And it would never be again. This is in 1935. Well, this didn't come to be, but he says, wars, he says, מלחמה התחלתא דגאולה. The war is the beginning of redemption. Why? Because the war sweeps the old dictators, it swept the Ottoman Empire and enabled the British to take hold and to give the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of the British Mandate. So this is a sign of redemption. We have to say, it should be said very, very carefully, but also the Second World War, I think that it's clear to us that we would all have preferred it not to become to be, right? But however, it is also a stage to the establishment of Medinat Israel, however you look at it. Now, it should have been established without it. It should have been that all of the Jews in the 1920s and 1930s, before the British closed the gates, would all come to Eretz Israel, and then everything would have been very, very different. It didn't happen. And the way it happened is the way it happened. I continue. The 11th, the 10th is the desire and the longing, the kmiha, as I said, of so many Jews, he says, to go to Eretz Israel. That in itself is a redemption. For thousands of years, no one spoke, very few spoke about Eretz Israel. Suddenly, Eretz Israel is spoke about everywhere. 11th, he says, the troubles that happens to our brothers in Russia and in Germany. And again, he writes that before we understand the magnitude. But he says these troubles are also a way of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to send all the Jews to Eretz Israel. 12, the establishment of Tel Aviv. A sign of redemption. A city from only Jews who are, he says it's nowadays more than 80,000 in 1935 when he published his Sefer. And all of them are, כולם מתפרנסים בנחת מיגיע כפיים. All of them are working for their living. And again, he's someone that appreciates Jews working for their living. And he says, ועתיד מזהיר לה, it has bright future, which is completely right. Bright future, להתקדם כהנה וכהנה. And 13, he says, in all of the world, economy is in crisis. Obviously, that's it, 1929. I speak about the Great Depression. But in Eretz Israel, economy was booming. So he says that's another sign of redemption. So these are the 13 principles of redemption. Again, amazing. And he gives that as a gift to Rav Rabinovich to show him that one can be a Zionist and modern in the good ways, in the good sense of modern, but also to keep a traditional and observant community. Against that's something, that's a feat that we are all still aspiring to. And he concludes, אין כל אלה וזולתם רק כניצוצות המתנוצצים מהמאור הגדול של הגאולה העתידה. These are sparks from the great redemption we are all waiting for. In 1948, in the establishment of the Jewish state, he published that in Djerba there would be 3 days of celebration. Daled, Hey, and Vav Yar would become days of celebration. Nowadays, you know that our Yom HaAtzmaut is moving from Daled to Hey to Vav every year. So his takana, I guess, became very important. He suggested that young Jews would go to what we call the birthright from all over the world to take a visit in Israel for 1 year, and maybe they would want to make Aliyah. It's his idea. It's a very interesting idea. And in 1949, he wanted to make Aliyah himself, and he made all the needed preparations. However, he became very sick. And his son writes, the son named Sasson, his son writes that when the son went to Tunisia, to the capital city, to make all of the arrangements from the paper, when he came back to Djerba, his father was very, very ill, and he couldn't take him. In 1950, he passed away, and in 2005, his bones were exhumed, and he made his aliyah, and he's buried in Har HaMenuchot in Yerushalayim, and to this day, his Torah is being learned especially by Tunisian Jews, but all over. In Bnei Akiva, they had a Chodesh Irgun a few years ago that was focused on his Torah and his teachings and his life. And this is, I think, a community that we have much, much to learn from, not only from his Zionist endeavor, but also, as I said, from his ability to combine very strict understanding of what chinuch needs to be, and on the other hand, openness to everything good that the world has to offer. Striking this balance is something, as I said a few times already in this shiur, is something that we can learn from him. Thank you so much, and Lag BaOmer Sameach. No, not improper parties, but Lag BaOmer Sameach.
תודה רבה. Thank you very much.
מצוין.